Hey guys, so I've posted this render of mine and some users asked me on how to achieve this look. I don't know how to describe it. It's definitely an NPR technique and maybe some old school airbrush look. So yeah, let's get into this because this is a relatively simple setup. So yeah, there are multiple parts to this, and the most critical parts are basically the atmosphere, so the fog or the distance fading, and then we have the general shading. So here you see these orange and red highlights and the bluish tint in the shadows, and the last part is this little speckles or noise. So yeah, let's do it step by step, and I'd say the first thing we do is the distance fading. Okay, so let's delete everything in my material. And we also would need to delete the sky because this is part of the setup. And let's do this quickly. And also I want to delete all the other materials too, because they are distracting me and they are basically the same or very similar to this. So I just exclude them from my geometry node tree. So it must be the ground, and I believe these are the trees. Yes. Okay, so we are left with a bare bones scene. Or maybe we bring back the ground just with the same material. And where do we define it? We define it here. And it's a structure material. Okay. So if we now render this, we should see nothing. Okay, so in my scene I have two sunlights, and I think both are colorless, so both are white. Yes. And right now, if I simply pull up a diffuse material, we should see, yes, the effect. So yeah, that's all this is to that. So the first thing we do is we create the sky. So for now, let's disable this object. And for the sky, I simply use the texture coordinate node and the window output. So if you plug this straight in here, you can see both coordinates, and we take the separate X, Y, and Z. And if we look at the Y coordinate, we see this nice gradient that goes from the bottom to the top. And here we can use a color ramp to color this gradient. So let's say you want it to be a light blue on the horizon and a darker blue in the sky. So maybe like this. And here we want a more saturated blue. Yeah, we can play around with the easing type here. So I'd like to work often with the easing type. And yeah, so you can adjust this to your preference. And now for the noise, we have multiple options, but in my rendering, I simply distorted my coordinates we pass here in the separate XYZ node. And we can do this with the noise texture. And if I look at this straight to the camera, you can see how this looks. And we also use the window coordinates, so it is mapped flat onto our render. and we need a fairly high noise amount for this effect. And if I simply take a vector math node and add this noise to my coordinates, we see that the result is really distorted, and it's a little bit harsh, so we need to scale the effect down, and this we can do with the vector math scale node. And here I can control the strength of the effect, and you can see that it kind of pulls the whole texture or coordinates to the bottom. And this is because our noise texture is in the range of 0 to 1. So all these 3 channels, the RGB channel goes from 0 to 1, and we want it to remap. So the values go maybe, for example, from -1 to 1, or in my case, I simply take another vector math node and subtract 0.5 from it. So the values go from -0.5 to +0.5, and now we can here control the strength. And yeah, so we can just simply play a little bit with the values of the noise texture. So maybe like this. Also maybe we can decrease the details. So yeah, that's actually to your preference. And now we have this nice airbrush looking effect. And right now what I want to do is I want to blend my material here with this sky color. So if you bring back our objects, you can see that the horizon is not faded. So we want to fade it into the sky. So there are multiple options. We can do this with compositing, but in my rendering I do it in the shader directly with the help of the camera distance. And we can get the camera distance with the camera info node or the camera data node. And here I can, for example, take the view distance, and with the multiply add node, this is simply 2 operations in one step, so we can multiply and add. And I need to put a fairly low amount in the multiply, and here I can simply adjust the start of the fading. So yeah, again, fairly low amount like this. We need to go even lower. Or maybe let's work with 2 separate nodes, so I can add first and then multiply. And yeah, this already looks kind of good, so we can maybe put this at 0.005. Okay, so to let the start, define the start, I simply subtract a little bit of here, and I increase this a tiny bit. So yeah, maybe like this. And now to fade this color, the white area here, into this color, we need to get the sky texture. And how to get it? We simply can go in our world shader and put a node group around this. And if we call this node group, for example, sky texture, we can get this node group here in my shader. If I look straight at it, you can see that it seems that the object disappeared, but it isn't disappearing. It simply mapped our sky texture straight to the camera. So it just looks like it is disappearing. You can see it is still there. And now we can use our camera depth to mix between the sky color and another color, and for this we can use the mix RGB node. And this is my mix factor, and this was the wrong order. So yeah, like this, and here we then later put our color information in. So for now, let's maybe give it a yellowish orange tint. And remember, with this here you can control the distance. So yeah. Okay, so this was the first step, or maybe the first two steps, because I also described how to apply this noise here. And it is really similar to what we do to the shader later on. But first let's get the shading right. So if we look straight on our base diffuse color, which is white, you can see that it is really bright. And this is because our sky texture at the moment is the primary light source besides of our two sunlights. And you see that it's very, very bright. And for this problem, I want to exclude this sky texture from affecting our material. And this we can do with the light path node. And now we say that the texture, the sky we have defined, should only have an effect to what our camera sees, and everything else should ignore this texture. And this is can simply be done with the is camera array. And if you put this in the factor here, and we have to reorder this like this, you can see that the sky texture now has no effect on our objects here. And so I want to take a value, a gray value, so we can simply take an RGB node. And here I say 0.5 is okay for now. I plug this in here, and here we can control the strength of the environment. And we want it to be neutral, and I show you why later. And yeah, so if we now go back in here, we see that it works. And if we, for example, want to change the sky again, we can enter the node group, maybe here, and we can play with these values. And because it is a node group, it synchronizes for each of the node groups we've used. Yeah. Okay. So now we have the sky set up, and to get the shading right, let's look at it again. And now the critical part is to convert this with the shader to RGB node. And this result I have here can be plugged into a color ramp texture. And now comes the fun part, because here we can control the look of the highlights and the shadows. So if we say, for example, we want yellowish highlights, we can put a yellow texture in here. And for the shadows, we want it to be blue. So we say we want this blue color. And now it is just a matter of defining more values. So we get here more saturated and more lighter. So I simply need to add more iterations, maybe like this. And then we can go crazy, like you want it to be. So maybe like this. Yeah, it's a little bit of fine-tuning, and it took some time for me to get the overall look right. So you have to play a little bit with these values here. And colors is a really difficult thing, and it's a very subtle effect. And to get it right is sometimes really hard. So yeah. So yeah, let's say we are okay with this. We can plug in our mix RGB node, and this should fade it out to the background. And yeah, you can see that it already looks kind of cool. The ground looks kind of messy, but this is because the shader doesn't work so well on it. So yeah, we can live with it for now. And now the next step is to apply some noise on this shader here, because the noise at the moment is only in the sky. And so we simply do the same thing like we did in the sky. We take a noise texture and the texture coordinate node with the window coordinates. And now we could copy this scale here to make it uniform. We also could make a node group out of this noise here, so it again synchronizes between this, but I won't bother for now. So I put the same value in here. But you can also use different values, it doesn't really matter. Now if I look at this, you can see the noise. And in my example, I think I've used the overlay or soft light. I'm not sure anymore. So let's look at it. Yeah, I think it was the soft light. Or let's have a look what overlay does. Also looks cool. So yeah, you can play around with these values. Yeah, so the other thing I've did was to create a procedural normal map to create these cracks. But I think it's a little bit too much for this tutorial, and you can figure it out yourself. So yeah. So maybe what I want to do is to define a ground material, because this looks really bad. So I simply copy this and call it ground. And then in my geometry nodes, I define it here. Ground material. And for the ground, I don't want all these blue tones. I simply want it to be, yeah, yellow. Maybe like this. Or maybe we want these blue shadows, because right now our shadows are red. So let's turn in the blue again. And yeah, so this is a really nice NPR shader technique I found. So simply working with the standard diffuse shader and then work with the color ramp to give it the colored look. And yeah, so it's obviously not physically correct. And what I also tend to do in my scenes that I render with NPR techniques is to go in the color management and switch it to either standard or raw, because filmic, it is more for realistic renders. So we can look how this is. So there is no pure white. And yeah, so for NPR look, I tend to use the standard. So yeah, I hope you've liked this video, and maybe you can put this to use, or maybe you can create some other techniques out of these. And yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this, and see you next time.